Today, I'm going to be speaking with Jim Freeman, who is author of the book Rich Thanks to Racism: How the Ultra Wealthy Profit from Racial Injustice, and also director of the Social Movement Support Lab at the University of Denver. Jim, it's so great to have you on today.
Thanks so much for having me, David.
So, I mean, to start with, let's get people into sort of the thesis and idea of the book. In what ways can racism be profitable? How do people monetize racism?
Yeah, the reason I wrote the book is I wanted to introduce this idea of strategic racism, right? Particularly after last summer, there's a lot more understanding of systemic racism, which is good and exciting. But the problem is that not many people understand what and who stand in the way of dismantling that. And there's also a problem too, I think, with the term, which is sort of vague and impersonal, right? It makes it seem like systemic racism is this natural occurrence. It's just sort of part of our society. So I wanted to introduce this idea of systemic racism to demonstrate to people that there are people who are profiting from it. There are people who are racism profiteers in this country, that there is intentionality behind these efforts. Um, because even when we do think that there's people on the other side of this fight, we think about the alt-right and those kind of folks, but that's not who's been passing all these laws that are responsible for systemic racism. They're not the ones who are doing the heavy lifting in defending or expanding these policies. So my work as a civil rights lawyer has been with the communities that are most impacted by systemic racism, Black and brown communities. I've been working with those communities for 20 years, and so I've seen up close what this looks like and how devastating it is. And what that really means in practice is that these corporate and Wall Street executives, these ultra wealthy billionaires, they make huge investments in these think tanks and advocacy organizations and media outlets that have been instrumental in preserving, defending, and expanding these dynamics, such as what we see in the criminal justice system, such as what we see in education and immigration. And like you say, they are profoundly profitable, these dynamics, for the ultra wealthy. They make money off of mass incarceration and immigrant detention and immigration enforcement and school privatization. And they also, they pay less in taxes when we as a society choose to dehumanize people rather than meeting their basic human needs. And then, one thing that became very clear, I think, to a lot of folks last summer is that systemic racism, particularly, the mass criminalization and incarceration system that we have, it's extremely effective at controlling us, at dividing us, at causing us not to recognize our common interests. And we really saw that in how police were used to really stamp down political protest. So all of those dynamics really help maintain the status quo, help the ultra wealthy maintain their political and economic power. And those are just, I think, some of the ways that they profit from these dynamics.
Yeah, so and that, I mean, that gives us a good introduction to a lot of different industries and corporations that are sort of directly connected to a lot of these issues. I'd be curious about your thoughts before we go back to that about, I don't know, I don't want to use the term more like benign or pedestrian corporations, but just things more associated with day to day. Like, for example, Starbucks and other companies that last summer started to make a big show of, we're going to do implicit bias training, and all of our managers and maybe even employees are going to go through a course and so on and so forth. I've always felt that that was essentially a PR decision, and number one, at its face, it didn't really pass the sniff test for me. But really, what got me thinking that was, I've not really found evidence that that type of training for a company like Starbucks, just to pick one, or others, really gets at the root of some of what is causing these issues to begin with. So I know that this is kind of a slight deviation from what you introduced to us, but what's your thought about that as a source of profit, or at least of positive PR?
Yeah, you make an excellent point, which is, you know, last summer we had what seems like virtually every corporation in America coming out with a statement denouncing systemic racism,
Yes.
um, proclaiming that Black Lives Matter. Um, and yet here we are, 9 months later, and what have those corporations done to actually dismantle these systems, right? To not just, like you say, do these sort of superficial diversity efforts, or to, donate some small, tiny percentage of their profits to Black-owned businesses. I'm talking about, real efforts to address these issues that are harming and even killing people in Black and brown communities. They're nowhere to be found. And in fact, for the most part, they continue to be on the opposite side of these fights. So, one thing that I talk a lot about is those we've had those types of efforts forever. Where we talk about how we're making progress, right? We're taking steps forward. Well, we've been doing that for over 100 years. You know what I mean? And it's got to be clear by now that you know those things aren't bad per se, but they're not even close to being enough. And you know, I think the question for us is how many more people are we going to allow to be harmed? How many more lives are we going to allow to be taken while we are content not to actually solve the problem, but to merely make progress? So I think when it comes to racial justice, we need to remove the word progress from our vocabulary.
Hmm.
I think it's time to advance real solutions. But to do so, I think it's going to require many more people understanding how and why corporate America and Wall Street are able to profit from other people's pain. And we're going to need many more white people in particular to understand how their struggles are deeply interconnected with the struggles of people of color, so that they recognize that the fight for racial justice is also their fight.
Now, when you talk about that interconnection, I'm leading here in the sense that I don't think you're talking about a sort of class reductionism of just realizing that in the same ways that a lot of these racial issues relate to class, that can also be a factor for. You're talking about a different type of interconnection. Am I right?
I am, yeah. I mean, I think there's different types of interconnection, but one was really only made apparent to me when I was researching and writing the book.
Hmm.
Um, which is, as I was diving in, so the book is really an effort to sort of follow the money behind systemic racism, or what I call strategic racism, to understand exactly where it's coming from, and the ideology behind it. But as I was doing that, it was really eye-opening for me because, you know, as I was learning more about where this money was coming and how strategic these investments were, I also realized how heavily invested the ultra wealthy are in pushing a political agenda that's been deeply harmful to white Americans as well. Not in the same ways, of course, and not always at the same levels, frequently not. Um, but what I say is that, like, if white people examine the reasons that their lives are far more difficult than they need to be, they will likely eventually run into the same set of organizations and individuals who are leading the
I
opposition
see.
against racial equality.
Yeah.
So, I, for one, was astonished to discover just how enormous an influence the ultra wealthy have on my life and on every other white person I know. Um, but then, yes, beyond that, like, we all need to get to the point where we can clearly see that education inequities and mass criminalization and anti-immigrant policies and all these other racial justice issues don't just harm those who attend the under-resourced schools or suffer the effects of over-policing or face the prospect of being deported. If we examine our lives carefully, we will all find evidence of harm caused by the reverberations from these unjust systems. And on the flip side, we also need to recognize that people who are fighting for racial justice aren't trying to, like, we're often treated like we're trying to, like, ruin the world, but the reality is we're trying to build a better world that benefits all people, and that when we do address these issues of systemic racism, it doesn't just help people of color who have the burden of those racial inequities lifted off them. We all stand to benefit when our neighbors are able to live higher quality lives, and the really rot of injustice is purged from our systems.
What are some examples of where you think the most notable progress has been made, like in the last 10 to 15 years on these issues?
Well, I think the most exciting progress happening within most recent memory is around law enforcement and the criminal justice system.
Hmm.
And people are really starting to interrogate this issue of police and the role that they serve and the role that they should serve, right? And people are asking questions, really important questions about how we actually keep our communities safe and healthy, and why have we tasked so much the police departments with so much that really they're ill-equipped to handle. I mean, that's certainly true in Black and brown communities, but it's true beyond that too. I mean, I think we have to recognize how, frankly, how deeply we've lied to communities of color over the years. I mean, for 40 years, basically, what U.S. policymakers have been saying to Black and brown communities is this: we can best keep you safe by being tough on crime, by flooding your communities with police officers, by using stop and frisk, by employing broken windows policing and cracking down on low-level offenses, by putting police in schools, by locking up people at the highest rates anywhere in the world, by doing the type of policing, frankly, that killed George Floyd and Dante Wright and so many others. And all along, the consistent message has been that these were the most effective strategies for improving public safety. But there is no evidence for that. There are no heavily policed and high incarceration communities that are flourishing socially, economically, culturally. There are just none. It's a null set. So it really is a deep, deep lie that we've been telling those communities for many years, and folks are starting to see through it. And I think that's very exciting.
When you think about some of the decisions that are made by corporations that are not directly involved, for example, like in incarceration, as you talked about, or some of these other specific areas, it seems that there is a kind of vicious cycle where even a chain restaurant, based on how it decides where to put new restaurants, and as a result where jobs are created and what impact that has on the food choices of people that may otherwise live in food deserts. I mean, a lot of these things seem very complex to me, because one can find reasons to think that almost any to give a really specific example, think of a fast food chain that says, hey, you know what? We do well in poor neighborhoods that are relative food deserts in terms of other options. There's not that many grocery stores or healthier alternatives. And so that's where we're going to go. And this worsens the health of the people in the neighborhood by okay. The counter, though, is, hey, they're creating some jobs in that neighborhood, though. If every such business decided we're not going to set up shop in this neighborhood, that's 100, that's 200, however many jobs that aren't brought there. And it very quickly becomes sort of like cloudy. What should be the top level interpretation of some of these business decisions that relate to race? How do we disaggregate that and start to pick apart something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly true that we have to become much more disciplined as a country in analyzing all of those decisions and the policies that influence those decisions through the lens of race, through the lens of systemic racism, and I would suggest strategic racism too. Because, and I'll go back to criminal justice because we were talking about it. The last summer when George Floyd was killed, when he was murdered, we were told over and over again that it was a wake-up call for the nation, right? But we never actually woke up, right? If we had, we would have come together around real solutions to those issues, around the vastly oversized and violent criminal justice system that's used within Black and brown communities as a catch-all solution for a huge variety of behaviors. We didn't actually do that. We didn't even really start that conversation. But it's not because we don't know how. It's not because they don't have a fix. Like we do, and there is. We don't do it because there's a very well-funded opposition that stands in the way, right? So you have organizations like ALEC, representing hundreds of the largest corporations in the US, working for decades to pass those various tough on crime policies. You have folks like the Koch brothers and all these other billionaires who've been pouring tens of billions of dollars into various right-wing think tanks and advocacy organizations that have been pushing this agenda and still do today. You have one of those think tanks, the Heritage Foundation, who after the uprising last summer against systemic racism, what they decided to do was launch a Back the Blue campaign, a Back the Blue police pledge that has now been signed by 200 members of Congress. So that's 200 members of Congress who have vowed to continue supporting the status quo in law enforcement.
Right.
And then you have one of those members of Congress, Senator Tom Cotton, one of the most powerful Republicans in the country, who tweets out a couple of weeks ago that in the US we have a major under-incarceration problem. So for me, that's what modern day racism looks like, is that we implement these public policies that we know are going to inflict needless harm on large groups of people, that we know will perpetuate racial inequities, that we know will lead to people getting killed. And then when that harm becomes apparent, we fail to address it appropriately, in significant part because it's economically beneficial for the ultra wealthy. So I think that's true in criminal justice. I think that's true in education. I think that's true in public health. Um, and so what we really need to do is, if we're going to address those issues, we really need to prioritize that and lift up those issues and collectively start looking at these issues through the lens of race so that we can start to design our public policies in a way that moves us towards the just and equitable society that all people deserve.
The book is rich thanks to racism, how the ultra wealthy profit from racial injustice. We've been speaking with the book's author, Jim Freeman. Jim, so great having you on, and I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much for having me, David.